Hi everyone, my name is Neeraja and I teach English at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Pramod K Nayar today. Professor Pramod Nayar is a senior professor at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, and it is our privilege that we have been able to host him as scholar in residence over the last few days. And today, Professor Nayar will be in conversation with me, talking about his recent work and talking about some of the future directions in which humanities as a field can go. So, welcome, Professor Nayar. I thought that we could begin by talking a little bit about the humanities. I think you have over more than a couple of decades, done a lot of very different kind of work, but also work that really moves the humanities in different directions, brings it into conversation with very current fields and concerns and interests. I know, for example, that you have recently become very interested in public humanities and public humanities as a field. So perhaps we could start by talking a little bit about what this term or this field, public humanities, really means, how we make sense of it, and then perhaps we can, move forward with discussing some of the more specific components of the field.
Thank you, Neeraja. Good to be in conversation with you here and being scholar in residence at Azim Premji and your department. I would think of the public humanities as the interface between academics, artists, heritage conservationists, and the general public. So I think of the public humanities as stepping out of the university and the classroom and moving into the space of the public, so that several of the concerns that the public have had for centuries now have been a subject of academic analytics. But the academic analytics have never been part of a public discourse, except for public intellectuals who write about the research they do in newspapers, periodicals, go on shows like this, talk programs and things like that. So I think it has a very essential function for multiple reasons. One, the public space of expression, which is being shrunk for various reasons across the world, in which the humanities ought to play a role in preventing that space from being shrunk. But also the fact that many of the concerns that the humanities have had, environment being top priority now, or health, ought to be the subject of public discourse, but from the perspectives and frameworks that have been developed within academia. So if, for example, we have, say, theoretical frames or academic analytical frames, philosophical frames that help us understand questions of health or medicine or biopolitics, those do impinge upon the world in certain ways, although they will not be called by any of those names. So nothing prevents us from taking the philosophical debate out into the open, utilizing the work of, say, artists, whether it's the visual cultures medium of film or graphic art or street art, and then making it available through our lens without calling it that. In other ways, I think of the public humanities as a way of determining public perceptions about topics and concerns that are closest to them. I think it has a very crucial role to play. Rather than just have the old idea that everybody is up for dialogue and the public is the place for dialogue, why can't the dialogue be informed by the theoretical rigor that humanities has traditionally had as its primary hunting ground? And you could then talk about, say, how art has developed certain ways of looking at the world, at microbes or at famines or war, and then bring it to the public. So I think it has a very crucial role in developing perceptions and eventually, therefore, developing the social and cultural imaginaries around these topics. So I think of it as an absolutely necessary next step.
So I think that what you're also saying is that there has to be a way in which the humanities speaks to other disciplines. From some of your examples, that's also something that I'm taking away. And that's also a necessary function, I think, that you're saying that the humanities play. And I think you're also making a case for the fact that our humanities classrooms, whether it be history or philosophy or literature, there has to be a way that the classroom in some ways engages with the world as well.
Yes.
And I think what might be, I think, a good thing to think about at this juncture is what are some of the ways in which we can do that? What are some of the ways in which we can bring, this world into the classroom or have the humanities speak across disciplines? So perhaps we can speak a little bit about, the domain that you largely have been working in, which is, English studies, which is your field. You could maybe talk a little bit about how you see English studies situating itself as, one of the humanities disciplines, which then has a very strong role to play in speaking to some of these fields that, we have been talking about, and in addressing the public in that sense. And I think that you're also bringing up this very important idea about the nature of the critique that has existed so far against the humanities and discourse in the university, by extension. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the role that English plays, and then see where we get to with those examples.
Yes. I will take away from what your question is as following, that bringing the classroom into the world and the world into the classroom. I think that's a very nice way of putting it. I also think that the world is a classroom. And when we speak about the public, surely the people in a classroom also constitute a public at least. So suppose we think in terms of the discipline I am trained to do, that is English studies and English literature studies in particular. Suppose you take a field or domain which is of crucial importance around the world, human rights. What can we do with, say, something like human rights and literature, which is something I've worked on for past decade and more. And then ask ourselves, what and how does literature do to contribute to the public understanding of human rights? So I would think, for example, fiction or poetry that foregrounds the idea of the person is the subject of human rights literature. But the person is also in various discourses a citizen, a stranger, an alien, a native, somebody who belongs and doesn't belong. And literature has always, as Jeffrey Garl Halpern would say, literature has always been concerned with otherness. And in a field like human rights and literature, we talk about individual persons, but also communities. Now, that surely is the matter of public interest, to ask ourselves, who do we define as belonging? Who is a citizen, who is not? What are the modes by which we define persons, and therefore, by extension, non-persons? Then for literary studies, where the history of textual criticism has foregrounded things like character, they are studies of persons. So we do get a sense of how the person or the human subject has a particular genealogy. So literature foregrounds the history of the human person, which if we take out into the public field via public humanities, we will say, oh, so in those kinds of novels, the working classes were not persons. So you immediately see a parallel. Literature is also that kind of link between so-called abstract characters whom we then recognize in the street. So literature is part of that world, except that when we say literature with a capital L, it speaks about a certain institutionalization of it, an instrumentalization of it, but it needn't be that way. So suppose we take literature of and about humans, we are taking human rights discourses into the public domain. Now, we tend to think of human rights as primarily something that political scientists or political philosophers are interested in. But well before political philosophers, literature has been invested in and interested in humans. That's what literature talks about, persons. So suppose you foreground that and tell the world, you know what, you want to understand oppression or injustice, nothing better than, here, read this novel. And you give them a 150-page novel. I know it's difficult to get people to read 150 pages of fiction now, but surely when you talk about that, you are making a connection. That, oh, so all that stuff in the novels, that's not entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to characters living or dead is purely coincidental. Yes, but you do build worlds inside a novel. A novel is a world. And the world also takes on narrative forms. The public humanities, if you are taking a field like human rights and literature, makes that connection, makes that bridge, that the world of the novel impinges upon the world outside, and conversely, characters are built upon what we see around us. But more importantly, literature also tells us about people unlike us. And that's a crucial part of the public humanities, that who is not included, who has been cancelled. Literature does that all the time. Like I said, via Harpam, it has always been concerned with outsiderhood. And when we read a novel, we are reading about people unlike us, distinct from us, people excluded from the mark of humanity itself. That is, I think, an absolutely brilliant way of taking it to the world and say, do you know what persons are? Do you know what? So there's a narrative tradition of human rights because there's a narrative tradition of humans and persons. And then you take it to the world and they say, oh, we now recognize the fact that what we thought was just a character is not. There's a social context in which that person was formed, was denied citizenship or accepted into citizenship. And that's pretty much the narrative of the world. So the public humanities has a very effective, for want of a better term, political function. And if we are able to take, say, literary texts there, and I would speak from the perspective of English literary studies, then there's nothing comparable to it. Maybe art would come close, but there's nothing like a piece of reflective writing about imaginary worlds, imaginary characters that will make the connection. My final point on that would be, it's something I've said before, that science explains the world as it is, but literature explains the world as it ought to be. There's a big difference. Possible worlds are sketched within the literary for the public to understand that the world need not be this way. The world could also be something else. And that's what the novel will show you in the pages of a book. So why can we not think of literary worlds as opening up alternatives to the current world we occupy? That would be the function of the public humanities.
I should say that, this really allows me to move very well into the next thing that I'm interested in chatting with you about, which is your other field of interest, which is the environmental humanities.
Mm-hmm.
Much of what you said for me echoes through in this larger field that you're interested in, and also your recent book, Vulnerable Earth, in which I think that you're making the case about literature and literature's response to the climate crisis as really being about imagining this very imminent possibility. Mm-hmm. It's really about, looking at novels and the kind of possibilities, the kind of signal characters they have in the form of, sometimes they're animals going extinct or mm-hmm. landscapes which are, under threat. So I thought that we could speak a little bit about how environmental humanities, maybe you can, define the field in some sense, but also, dwell on how this is yet another field in which humanities is starting to play a very crucial role in asking questions and also engaging with something that's a very, important question for several fields, not just the humanities. So that's something we could talk about, I think.
I got interested in it via events, catastrophes like Bhopal. I was looking at memoirs, for example, an integral component of the literary canon now, and what they had to say as ear witness and eyewitness to what happened. But also that it's not possible for people to recognize very often from the science of climate change as to what is going on. The scientific part is absolutely crucial, but how many of us actually follow COP and what they are saying about it, or climate finance or climate insurance? It's very difficult to visualize this. And when I was researching the history of meteorology in colonial India and other places, I discovered that, for example, Prudential Insurance had a map of the world where the tropics were painted red, and the premium for Englishmen and women who were traveling to that zone was much higher. They said, this is dangerous territory. So you were already mapping the world in certain ways, and that's the language. Then you have novels that do the same thing. The famous idea that the Englishmen would last 2 monsoons in India. That was the phrase, 2 monsoons. Mm-hmm. And now we have the climate emergency narrative, which is a term that Johan Hoglund has just used to describe as the title of his new book, the climate emergency narrative. So it's no longer global warming, it's global boiling now. And as Margaret Atwood would say, why do we think of it as climate change? We should call it everything change. Because it's not one or the other, it's everything. And in those contexts, the literary shows us that even an incremental increase, say in temperatures or sea levels rising, is serious. Because the science is, in many cases, not something we want to read and understand, tackle. But the other problem is also how do you communicate the urgency of the situation? Because this is a slow process. It has taken years. As somebody pointed out, it took 1.5 million years for petroleum to be collected after sedimentation, fossils, and all that. And it took 500 years for us to exhaust it. How do you capture this? 1.5 million versus 450, 500 years? It's not imaginable, except that literature can do that. So there's a Marshallese Island poet who says, for you, 1.5 versus 2 is nothing. For us, it's life and death, or usually it's life or death. Because 1.5 degree rise in temperatures means the Pacific Islands will drown. Don't you think that's serious? She asks. This is in the form of a poem. Now, you would be able to endlessly argue 1.5 versus 2, but literature can do that in the form of 6 lines of a poem. At 1.5, and she says, we have seen the Pacific flooding our cemeteries, entering our homes. And that's like a punch to your gut, saying, oh goodness, so 1.5 and 2 is not just a question of 0.5, this or that decimal, but it means life and death. And to me, literature does that very effectively, which is why my interest in the environmental humanities. I will take it for granted that literature is the queen of the humanities. So in the environmental humanities informed by philosophy, for example, people writing about deep time, all of that, and we now have Noah Harrington's entire book, Deep Time and Literary History. And you discover that people have been interested in deep time for a long time, a very long time. And environmental humanities brings in some of the science, some of the philosophy, and of course, a lot of the literature. And to me, the environmental humanities is a response to an urgency. It speaks to the moment. And how can you not speak to the public about something that is so drastic and yet so incremental? So to me, what's important is that you can have the apocalyptic model of writing about disaster, or you can have something that maps 1 millennia. Nobody will read a 1 millennia long novel. But literature can capture that, encapsulate it. Stephen Baxter does that. Other people do that. So for me, environmental humanities offers us a modality through which we can speak about something urgent, something very pressing, the climate emergency, and have it infused with philosophical ideas about, say, deep time, extinction and species loss, rewilding. So several of the concepts that perhaps come to us from philosophy or geological sciences, geography, are things that will inform the literature and therefore our teaching and reading of literature. So why not read it in and for the public, outside the class? Why not take it to the world and say, you know what, I can't explain what 1.5 versus 2 can be, but let me give it to you in the voice of a person who lives on an island that will be submerged if this happens. 5 lines. Those 5 lines are enough for people to, oh my goodness, that's a lot. Yes, it is. Or you can read 400 pages of a scientific report on what happens to the Pacific Islands if temperatures go up and the seas rise. And again, I'll bring environmental humanities back in conversation with my other interests, human rights and literature. You can read a report from Amnesty, or you can read the novel about it. Inevitably, people will pick up the novel, not 450 pages of the disappeared generation and things like that. The novel is better to read, and I would endorse that. So I would think of the environmental humanities and human rights and literature as inseparable, also for one more reason, and I'll stop my response to this question with that it's impossible to separate environmental injustice from social injustice. They go together. And that is where the contemporary literature does make its point about the post-colony, where social and environmental injustice go together, responses to that. So I cannot think of the environmental humanities as not also including, say, climate justice, the climate refugee, and a little bit of the science, which, like I said, is something we don't want to do. The public understanding of science, which is the journal's title also, tries to do that, but it still remains a huge deterrent. But the more effective way of communicating it, whether we are doing environmental humanities, and like I said, it's inseparable from human rights and literature, is to introduce the literary into this. So you can do your Mad Adam trilogy if you want. You can do a bunch of post-colonial poets, Native American poets like Simon Ortiz or Linda Hogan, who are talking the same thing. When Linda Hogan says, you know, if you care for the earth, it cares for you back. And that's the dedication to a volume called Dark Sweet, which Hogan does. And in that one set of lines, this is a dedication and not part of the poetry, she's actually referencing the 1990s Fisher-Toronto definition that care is defined as what we do to heal the world, to sustain it and ourselves. And it also includes the non-human. You can read the sociological tract about it, or you can read Linda Hogan's poem about it. I would opt for the poem. Now, suppose you make that poem a public performance piece. You have done two things. You have done environmental humanities, you have done human rights and literature. So climate justice is woven into it, multi-species loss is woven into it, extinction narratives are woven into it. To me, that makes environmental humanities with human rights and literature the centerpiece of a public humanities project. That's what I would think.
Thanks so much. I also wanted to speak a little bit about your work as the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies. You hold the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad.
It's a heavy chair.
It's a heavy chair. And so in some sense, that also gives a certain practitioner domain, practitioner kind of, slant to this, right? Where you have also been practicing for, the tenure of the chair so far. You have been practicing some of what you have been saying about engaging with these public issues and bringing, literature in conversation with some of these things. So I have a two-part kind of thing that, I think that it would be nice for us to hear about. One is to share with us the kind of work that the chair has been doing, because I know that, there have been creation of educational materials, training of teachers, different kinds of things that you have been doing to make sure that, people know about this field and find ways to, enter the field, engage with it, see how they can work in it. But I was also, very curious, and I think our viewers will also be curious to, in their own minds, create a certain, either genealogy or a certain distinction between the way in which we have understood that literature has always built a certain sensitivity, instills in you a need to care for others. And specifically with the environment and with other species, there is a long history in literature of writers who have engaged the environment, who have been interested in, the really pressing issues of their time. So I thought that it might be nice to also reflect on how you see vulnerability studies as a field that, is doing something now that is very crucial, very different from the much longer, in some sense, history where you have instances where writers have engaged with the environment. So that's something we could talk about a little bit.
Yeah. So the chair's mandate is that of a teaching and research unit. So we don't actually do fieldwork or ground level survey. So it's primarily focused on pedagogy and things like that. So yes, we are focused on developing educational materials, and as part of the mandate, it is an OER that we develop at each point. So all of our talks are available
freely online. Educational resource.
Yes, an online educational resource. So it just has to be available. It's not behind a paywall. And that's part of our mandate and part of the political leaning of the chair, that it should be made available to anyone and everyone. So that's the first thing. The second is we have run short-term courses. We did one last year on literature and sustainability and precarity. So we had a week-long program on that, where we again highlighted the literary. And like you said, we have noted the fact that there's a tradition of literary texts and authors who have been interested in questions of, is the model of consumption that we have seen tenable? And people were asking this question in the 19th century. For example, A Journey to the Center of the Earth is one of the first novels that says, we are going to exhaust the resources. He's talking about it, for God's sake, in the middle of the 19th century. How prescient is that? And one says, we are overusing things. We note the fact that it's only a few hundred years into steam. And one is already worrying about the fact that we are going to exhaust the resources. So there's an antecedent, a genealogy to this. So part of our mandate, like I said, has been teaching and training. So we have offered courses within our MA program, electives, to do this, to keep up this end of things. So we have offered courses on vulnerability and literature and things like that. Our OERs are wide-ranging. We have also incidentally brought in scientists to try and speak in common person's language. So we had a glaciologist talking about it. And the glaciologist, Pradhananga from Nepal, he's a UNESCO chair in mountain water sustainability there. And got him to agree by giving him Craig Santos Perez's poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Glacier. He said, I didn't know there were poems about glaciers. I said, and we don't know anything of what you do as a glaciologist. What is a glaciologist? So he gave us a talk about it. Then we had a green chemist speak about chemistry. And we have been part of forums where paleontologists have spoken. So trying to do a little bit of the science as well. It's not very easy. So the OERs definitely help. And it's part of the mandate. We have gone and done a whole bunch of lectures. We have done workshops and training programs on how to read for sustainability, for example. We are starting end of February a year-long program called the Literature of Sustainability, Reading, Writing and the SDGs. So all 17 SDGs being covered by 30 speakers from around the world who will talk about literary texts that have addressed sustainability and SDGs, one or the other, but not called it Sustainable Development Goals for obvious reasons. So that takes care of a bunch of educational materials. These talks will also be made available online. That's one. The second, the disciplinary question. Yes, there is a genealogy and antecedent to vulnerability studies. And to go back to the definition I gave first, that we have all, literature has always been interested in outsiderhood. Now, the focus for us is the vulnerable subject, not defined as human or non-human, or even as the non-living, because we also tend to think of the glacier as a vulnerable.
That's right.
Yeah, the river. And in parts of the world, there are debates whether we should declare rivers as corporate bodies and things like that. So we are interested in vulnerable subjects in the foreground. And the social, cultural, and various factors that construct them in varying degrees of vulnerability and precarity. So while there is, for example, a tradition of eco-criticism that foregrounds nature, you want to look at, say, John Clare, who talks about it, the English Romantics, who of course talk about it, praise, of course, for nature, quasi-divine status for nature, but also worries about nature, and all the way to the 20th century where species loss is the subject of novels and novelists writing about it. So for us, it coheres into what we are thinking of as vulnerability studies as part of the chair's mandate. We also do things which are from other disciplines. So for example, we have a very strong interest in aging and vulnerability. So we have talks, my colleague and friend, Professor Anna Kurian, does work with that. Childhood and vulnerability, race, vulnerability, those ones. And we have had people speaking about migration. So our foregrounded person is the vulnerable subject, which involves having the philosophical background, the literary cultural background, and a little bit of the scientific background. So for us, when we think of, on behalf of the chair, what constitutes vulnerability today? How is it constructed? So are we looking at pandas or persons? Both. So we would see vulnerable studies as the coming together of multiple strands of thought. It's built upon also the work I did myself with human rights for the last 10, 12 years, which in some ways, and that sounds terribly immodest, climaxes in vulnerability studies for me. And like I said, with my colleague Anna doing aging, people doing gender, we have had multiple dimensions coming together. We hesitate to call it a discipline as such. It's a discipline in formation, though publishers have been saying it's a discipline, why don't you put together a handbook and things like that. We are not yet sure it comes together. We have not been able to do certain things in this discipline. For example, the economics of vulnerability has not come into the thing yet. If you were to do a SWOT analysis of this. And yes, it's a gap. But what we think vulnerability studies has done, and it's now tangible in its outcome, there are conferences around the country being done on vulnerability studies. So it has suddenly become a kind of lingua franca, if not a discipline. And people are asking questions about it. Next week, IIT Hyderabad is hosting a Vulnerable Bodies in Literature and Culture as a conference. And there, the centerpiece is the body. And planetary bodies, okay. Human bodies, yes. Non-human, yes. Non-living bodies, yes. So vulnerability becomes a prism. And the job, the mandate is to think of vulnerability as the lens through which we view the world. So for me, like I said, it brings several threads together. My interest in human rights, the industrial victim in, say, Bhopal, the poetry of vulnerability from the formerly colonized nations, extreme cultures, torture victims, human rights victims, all of them. So we are thinking of it as the making of a certain kind of lens to view the world. The vulnerable subject, who would be the subject of human rights discourse, would be the subject of health studies, and with subdomains, aging, gender, race, linguistic and other categories, all of whom are vulnerable. And the focus is to think of social, cultural factors that construct people. All of us are vulnerable at some point or other in certain ways. I'm in a city where I don't speak the language. I find myself vulnerable in certain ways. Though, of course, devices now enable you to not have that. But vulnerability is constructed, which is why even the United Nations has a most vulnerable groups categorization in the MVGs. And they have a whole list of people. And it's an absolutely stunning map. And it's a dynamic map. Then why can't we also think of the IUCN's Red List as a list of vulnerable species? And it's interesting because the life form least prone to or likely to go extinct is humanity, according to the IUCN's Red List. Now that's the construction of a very clear visual representation of vulnerability. So I would like to conclude with that we are also interested in modes of representing vulnerability, literature of course, but also the visual arts. So we have people who have put together for our site graphic novels on vulnerability, visual cultures such as painting from Goya to the present on vulnerability, war and vulnerability, which tell people who care to go through the website, I'm afraid it sounds like a bit of a publicity thing, I understand, that there are ways and modalities of talking about vulnerability. So if you're a visual cultures person, so like I said, it's a lens. Also, you can view Goya through this. You can look at war memorials through this. You can look at literature through this. So it's a lens that cuts across multiple modalities. And our interest is in those. What are the forms, to use a slightly more technical term, representational strategies through which we can talk about it, about these forms and degrees of vulnerability. So we think of it as bringing together multiple strands. And you cannot say, I'm not really interested in the philosophy part of it, because the idea of the person stems from the philosophical. It comes from the medico-legal, right from Jonathan Sawdey downwards. It looks at things like memorial cultures that also memorialize persons and processes and consequences in certain ways. So as you can see, there are so many things that come together. We are barely scratching the surface here. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, it gives me a chance to talk about the chair's work also. So that's good.
I think that sounds absolutely fascinating and, and really a wonderful initiative. And in many ways, I think it also goes back to what we started with the public humanities, because there is here a forum that is allowing conversation about something across disciplines. It is allowing a certain analysis and interpretation of things that are very real, very current to us now. And it is also allowing a kind of re-looking and a re-evaluation of some of the things that maybe we have now become used to interpreting a certain way. And this really refreshes the way that we look at some of these texts that we may know, but then it puts it in conversation with other kinds of discourses, other kinds of strands of thought.
Absolutely, because we all now suffer from interpretation fatigue.
Absolutely.
Not just compassion fatigue, but interpretation fatigue. So are there new ways? There are maybe not new texts, but there should be new ways of looking at old texts too.
Absolutely.
So when, for example, we did a roundtable very early, it was called Conceptualizing Vulnerability. So we had people doing informational vulnerability, and we had people coming to us from the sociology of medicine and sociology of gender angle in conversation. So we then discovered that people are actually talking about those subject to informational precarity, people with no access to reliable information, the untrustworthiness of information. And then we had artists talking about how you represent famine in visual culture. So we thought, okay, so there are artists also are, they don't call it that. So perhaps we have done what humanities does best. We have appended labels to things. That's very likely a possibility. But if we have reached a stage of information and interpretation fatigue, then perhaps the need is for a new register of discourse, a new register of analytics. So we see, like I said, to change slightly what I said as a lens through which to view the world. For the public, we are offering, I think, like I said, it sounds rather immodest so early in the work of the chair, that we are offering a cultural cognitive apparatus through which to view the world. And that we hope is refreshing in the age of interpretation fatigue. So that brings us right back to the point that these materials are out there. Do you want to look at a conversation between, say, a sociologist of medicine, somebody who does culture studies with memorials, and somebody who does hardcore literary studies? All of it is there. So people who are looking at somebody talking about a film that is showcasing migration concerns, and somebody who's talking about speculative fiction, gender, and vulnerability. What do they have to say to each other? Well, that's up to you. So in the public domain, it's there. So it's, like I said, it brings it all together under one roof. And that, for us, makes the UNESCO chair a public humanities initiative above all else.
I think perhaps, one of the things that, that is interesting me at this point, and that also allows us to talk a little bit about, our literature program here at, Azim Premji University, and some of the ways in which we are trying to think through how we can really bring the world and the classroom in conversation with one another. One of the challenges with teaching, literature in the classroom is that it is work that does not very typically take you out. And I know that a lot of public humanities initiatives are about having students go out and make contact, maybe even with the local community, or in some ways think about how what you're reading here and now, whether it's from 200 years ago or even, longer, or if it's something that you're very immersed in. For us, I think a big sort of, vision, educational vision, is about really making that very relevant to the students. So I guess what I thought we could really end this with is to hear your thoughts on whether you think the public humanities in some way can make it into the literature curriculum. If it does make it into the literature curriculum, what are some of the ways in which students can engage with texts? What is some of the work they can do? So it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on that.
When I walk to and fro offices and other places, I look at the mural in the middle of your quadrangle there, and that's a public art initiative. What it means could mean different things to different people, but there at the heart of APU's campus is a public art installation. And when you think of that as a point of departure, then the literary is the next step. It's odd for me to say literary is the next step. It should be the first step, but yeah, never mind.
Right.
So if you were to think of the classroom and the world and the transaction across, then I think a higher education institution like APU is perfectly poised to take off on that. A short-term program on the public humanities, which will have as a centerpiece art and literature, but adjunct to disciplines like environment and public health, which intersect with these interests. You can use, for instance, you and your colleagues' interest in the fine arts, painting and film, documentaries and literature, and address concerns that are of the public. So suppose, for instance, I was speaking to Jayanti yesterday, and she was very interested in when I was telling her about critical plant studies. And her idea, I think, would fit APU's program very well. A workshop on, say, nature writing, which will make the students learn two things: go out and observe the world, and then learn how to write about it. So you have two things: the world as narrative and the narrative of the world. They will come together, because ultimately, to talk about the world still requires a narrative strategy. Whether it is in the form of a documentary, a piece of poetry, or a memoir, you still require a narrative. So suppose we do in your BA curriculum a small component of the public humanities. I would think, for example, sending them out to observe rock formations, the mural outside, people, anything, and then tell us what is the best way to talk about, say, the crisis affecting them in the ever hotter Bangalore summer. They will quickly realize two things. One, it's good to observe, but it's never enough to just observe. You need to be able to talk about it. And talking is narrative. So suppose we tell them, why don't you give us a couple of paragraphs on the world of the immediate environs of the university? So APU, because of its commitment to pedagogic practices, the social world, would be a brilliant place to launch a public humanities initiative, where the humanities scholars come together with some inputs from the science people, whether it's public health, development studies, or glaciology or geology, and train students that the world is out there, but the world requires narratives, and narrative is our field, not that of the scientists alone. They will give you the data, but who reads the data? Only fellow scientists. Will the public read the data? The answer is no. But will the public read the poetry about it? Perhaps. There's more likelihood of them doing it. So why not train the students into thinking the world is a narrative, but what is the narrative of the world? And by of, I mean it belongs to the world, but it's also a descriptor of what you can do with it. Those, I think, would be great to start with. And I think you are admirably poised to do so.
That actually echoes very well with many of the things that we do try to do. In fact, writing, nature writing, there are, quite often initiatives that are sometimes housed within the sciences, sometimes across disciplines. But that was very illuminating. So, Professor Nayar, I want to thank you for giving us so much food for thought, for sharing so generously your ideas and your experiences with the chair's initiatives. I wish the chair all success. It seems poised to be doing something really, truly very exciting and very innovative. And thank you everyone for listening to us.
Thank you, Neeraja, for that lovely set of questions.